The morning of May 17th, 1943, dawned cold and grey over the submarine pens at Lorient, on the French coast. By 7 in the morning, the German Flak batteries ringing the concrete fortress had already received their alert. American heavy bombers were coming, again. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker stood at his station beside the 88mm Flak 36 gun, one of 78 such weapons positioned around the target. At 24 years old, he'd been firing at Allied bombers for nearly 2 years. He knew the drill. The Americans would come in daylight, flying in their rigid formations at 25,000 feet. They would fly straight and level over the target, refusing to take evasive action, and his crew would fill the sky with steel. The theory was elegant. Each 88mm shell contained a 20-pound explosive charge that detonated at a preset altitude, sending 1,500 jagged fragments through the air in a killing radius of 200 yards. With 78 guns firing, the mathematics seemed inescapable. No aircraft could survive passage through such a barrage. But Becker had learned, over 23 months of watching American bombers, that the mathematics didn't always work the way Berlin claimed they would. The first formations appeared as specks against the morning sky, just after 9. Boeing B-17, flying fortresses, the Americans called them. 4-engine heavy bombers, each carrying 10 men and thousands of pounds of explosives. They came in combat boxes, 18 or 21 aircraft stacked in staggered formations designed to concentrate their defensive fire. Becker's battery commander shouted coordinates. The loading crew spun the elevation wheel. The fuse setter adjusted the timing mechanism. The gun fired with a crack that made his ears ring even through the cotton wadding. The sky above Lorient turned black with bursts. From the ground, it looked like a solid wall of explosions. Surely nothing could fly through that. Surely the formation would break, the bombers scatter, the attack fail. They didn't break. They flew straight through. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Becker watched one particular bomber near the front of the lead group. He could see the flashes as shells burst around it. He saw metal tear from the starboard wing. He saw smoke trail from an engine. But it held its position. It released its bombs, and then it turned for home, still flying. That bomber, though Becker didn't know its name, was called the Memphis Belle. And by the end of that day, it would complete its 25th combat mission and enter history as the first American heavy bomber in the European theatre to finish a full combat tour with its crew intact. But for Becker and thousands of German flak gunners like him, the Memphis Belle represented something more troubling than a propaganda victory for the Americans. It represented a fundamental miscalculation in German military thinking. The Luftwaffe had built its anti-aircraft defences around a simple assumption, that sustained damage would bring down enemy aircraft. The mathematics were clear, the doctrine was sound. The 88mm flak gun was, by any objective measure, one of the finest anti-aircraft weapons ever created. What they hadn't anticipated was that the Americans would build bombers specifically designed to absorb punishment and continue flying. The B-17 wasn't just a heavy bomber, it was a machine engineered from the ground up around a single revolutionary principle: redundancy. To understand why this shocked the Germans, we must first understand what they expected. German military engineering, particularly in aviation, emphasized precision, efficiency, and performance optimization. Every component served a specific purpose. Weight was minimized. Systems were streamlined. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, for instance, was a masterpiece of focused design. It carried exactly what it needed to perform its mission and nothing more. This philosophy had served German aviation well in the 1930s and early war years. Their aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and effective. The Americans built differently. When Boeing's engineers designed the B-17 inches 1934, they were responding to a U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a bomber capable of long-range missions over water, specifically to reinforce American territories in Hawaii, Panama, and Alaska. The implication was clear. These bombers would operate far from friendly bases, often beyond fighter escort range, and they would need to survive on their own. The solution wasn't to make the aircraft invulnerable, it was to make it able to continue functioning even when damaged. The B-17's fuselage was constructed of thin aluminum, deliberately designed to distribute structural loads evenly throughout the frame. This meant that damage to one section wouldn't cause catastrophic failure of the entire structure. The aircraft could lose significant portions of its tail, wings, or nose, and remain airworthy. Edward C. Wells, the Boeing engineer who designed the fuselage as a personal project, understood that structural redundancy would save more lives than thicker armor. The fuel system embodied this philosophy completely. Rather than using a few large fuel tanks, which would be catastrophic if punctured, the B-17 carried its fuel in multiple separate tanks. The basic B-17F model carried 6 standard wing tanks holding 1,700 gallons. Starting with B-17F Block 80, manufactured in April 1943, Boeing added what became known as Tokyo tanks, 9 individual, collapsible, self-sealing cells in each outer wing, adding another 1,080 gallons of capacity. Self-sealing fuel tanks were themselves a party revelation in combat aviation. Developed in the late 1930s, these tanks contained a rubber inner lining that would swell and seal when exposed to fuel and air. A bullet or shell fragment could punch through the tank, but the hole would seal itself before significant fuel was lost. More importantly, it would prevent the fuel from spraying into the surrounding structure, where it could ignite. German aircraft used self-sealing tanks too by this point in the war. But the B-17's fuel system went further. With multiple tanks feeding each engine, a bomber could lose several fuel cells entirely and still have enough fuel to reach home. The transfer system included selector valves and an electrical pump that could move fuel from any tank to any engine. If one engine was hit, its fuel could be redistributed. If multiple tanks were punctured, the remaining tanks could keep the surviving engines running. The same principle extended to the engines themselves. The B-17G model, which would enter production in summer 1943, was powered by 4 Wright R-1000, 820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Crucially, the aircraft could fly on 3 engines. It could even fly on 2 engines, though altitude would be lost. There are documented cases of B-17 seconds returning to England on a single functioning engine. The electrical system was redundant. The hydraulic systems were redundant. The control cables to the tail ran along both sides of the fuselage, so that severing one set wouldn't leave the aircraft uncontrollable. Even the crew positions were distributed throughout the aircraft, so that losing one section to enemy fire wouldn't eliminate all personnel capable of performing a critical function. This wasn't German engineering philosophy. This was American industrial thinking applied to aerial warfare. The principle was simple. Build it strong enough to take damage, give it enough backup systems that single-point failures don't matter, and accept the weight penalty, because you have the engines to compensate. American factories could produce powerful engines. American factories could produce thousands of bombers. What American commanders needed were bombers that would bring their crews home. The Memphis Belle, over the course of its 25 missions, demonstrated exactly why this approach worked. The numbers themselves tell part of the story. Between November 7th, 1942, and May 17th, 1943, the Belle flew 25 combat missions totaling 148 hours and 50 minutes of flight time. The crew covered more than 20,000 combat miles. They dropped more than 60 tons of bombs on targets across Germany, France, and Belgium. They engaged German fighters repeatedly, claiming 8 confirmed kills, 5 probable kills, and at least 12 damaged enemy aircraft, but it was the punishment the aircraft absorbed that made it remarkable. On 5 separate occasions, the Memphis Belle had an engine shot out by flak or fighters. Each time, the crew feathered the damaged propeller to reduce drag, redistributed fuel to the remaining engines, and flew home on reduced power. On one mission, a diving Focke-Wulf 190 came straight at the aircraft and riddled the tail section with 20mm cannon fire. The tail caught fire. The crew extinguished it. When pilot Robert Morgan climbed back to assess the damage, he found that the tail was so badly destroyed, it looked like the aircraft had no tail at all. The elevator control surfaces were damaged so severely that the control cables jammed. Morgan flew the aircraft back to Bassingbourn, England, a flight of over 2 hours, and managed to land it despite barely functioning controls. The bomber was repaired and flew again. On the mission to Saint-Nazaire on February 16, 1943, the Memphis Belle took severe battle damage from German fighters. The aircraft required extensive repairs and missed the next several missions, but the damage that would have been fatal to a less robustly designed aircraft was, for the B-17, repairable. The production line built standardized components. The maintenance crews had spare parts. The bomber was patched, tested, and returned to combat. By May 1943, the Memphis Belle's fuselage was, according to multiple accounts, riddled with bullet holes and pocked with flak damage. The precise count of hits isn't documented in official records, but post-mission damage assessments regularly catalogued hundreds of holes in returning B-17 seconds. Photographs of the Belle show extensive patching and repair work across the airframe. The aircraft had been shot to pieces, repeatedly, and had continued flying. This is what Klaus Becker and his fellow flak gunners were seeing from the ground, mission after mission. They were firing, they were hitting. The black bursts of 88mm shells were tearing into the American formations. And the bombers kept coming. The German expectation had been straightforward. Hit the enemy enough times and they'll fall. But enough times was proving to be far more than anticipated. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, analyzing wreckage and combat reports, discovered that bringing down a B-17 required an average of 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells fired from the rear. Given that fighter pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired, this meant a pilot needed to fire 1,020mm rounds at a single bomber to achieve enough hits for a kill. The Focke-Wulf 190, one of Germany's best interceptors, carried only 500 rounds per cannon in its early belt-fed configuration. For the flak batteries, the numbers were even more sobering. In 1941 and early 1942, when German crews were experienced and American bomber defenses were still developing, it took approximately 4,088mm shells to bring down one bomber. By 1944, as crew quality declined and Allied electronic warfare improved, that number had risen to 16,000 shells per kill. 16,000 shells for one bomber. To a German officer trained in resource efficiency, these numbers were catastrophic. The Reich was expending enormous quantities of ammunition, dedicating hundreds of thousands of personnel to flak batteries and positioning thousands of guns around strategic targets. And the Americans were still getting through. The problem wasn't that German weapons were ineffective. An 88mm shell that struck directly or burst close enough would absolutely destroy a bomber. The problem was that the Americans had accepted that their bombers would be hit repeatedly and had designed them to keep flying anyway. This represented a fundamental difference in how the two sides understood aerial warfare. The German doctrine assumed that damage equals destruction. The American doctrine assumed that damage was inevitable and focused on survivability. One philosophy optimized for preventing damage, the other optimized for absorbing it. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, would later state that flak was the biggest factor affecting bombing accuracy. He understood that forcing bombers to fly higher reduced flak effectiveness but also reduced bombing accuracy. The balance wasn't about avoiding damage. It was about accepting damage while still completing the mission. The strategic implications of this were profound. Germany couldn't simply shoot down the American bomber formations. The mathematics didn't support it. Even with thousands of guns, even with experienced crews, even with proximity-fused shells, which Germany never developed, the rate of bomber loss was too low to stop the campaign. In the first 3 months of American daylight bombing operations from England, approximately 80% of bombers were lost. Those were unsustainable casualties, and the Americans temporarily suspended deep penetration raids. But by mid-1943, as tactics improved and fighter escorts became available, loss rates dropped below 10%. By late 1944, losses to Flak were running below 1% of sorties. The Memphis Belle completed its 25th mission on May 17, 1943, exactly 6 months after its first combat mission. The 25th mission threshold was significant. U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine held that a crew completing 25 missions had beaten the odds and earned rotation back to the States. In the early months of the bombing campaign, few crews reached that number. Belle and her crew did. After landing at Bassingbourn following the Lorient mission, pilot Robert Morgan and his crew were greeted with the realization that they were going home. The bomber would not fly more than combat missions. Instead, it would be flown back to the United States for a war bond tour, along with its crew. The American public needed heroes. The Army needed to demonstrate that the bombing campaign wasn't a meat grinder, that crews could survive. The Memphis Belle became that symbol. What the public saw was the glamour, the photogenic bomber, the handsome young crew, the nose art featuring a pin-up girl painted by Esquire magazine artist George Petty. What they didn't see, quite as clearly, was the engineering triumph that the aircraft represented. The Memphis Belle wasn't special because it was particularly lucky. It was special because it was typical. Thousands of B-17 seconds absorbed tremendous damage and brought their crews home. The fortresses that survived mid-air collisions with German fighters, that flew with entire nose sections blown off, that landed with wings perforated by hundreds of holes, these weren't miraculous exceptions. They were examples of design philosophy, working as intended. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Klaus Becker, standing beside his flak gun at Lorient, this was the new reality of the air war. The Americans would keep coming, his gun would keep firing, some bombers would fall. But not enough. Never enough to stop them. The Belle flew home to America in June 1943. It toured 31 cities. Millions of Americans saw it. Morgan and his crew gave speeches, sold bonds, and became celebrities. Hollywood director William Wyler had filmed the crew on several missions, and his documentary, The Memphis Belle, released in 1944, showed American audiences what combat over Europe actually looked like. But by then, the lesson of the Memphis Belle was already obsolete in a sense. The B-17G, with its additional armament and refined defensive systems, was rolling off production lines at Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega factories. P-51 Mustang fighters, with drop tanks that extended their range to Berlin and back, were beginning to escort bomber formations all the way to target. The air war was evolving. The balance was shifting. Germany's flak defenses weren't failing because the weapons were bad. They were failing because the Americans had solved the problem those weapons were designed to create. You couldn't stop bombers by damaging them if the bombers were built to keep flying when damaged. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was deploying 128mm flak guns, larger, more powerful weapons, designed to bring down aircraft with fewer hits. But even these couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. The Americans were building bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. American industry produced 12,730 B-17 seconds during the war. Even at Germany's most effective rates of attrition, the bombers kept coming. The Memphis Belle, retired from combat after 25 missions, survived the war intact. After its bond tour, it served in training commands in Florida until 1945, then was sent to a storage facility in Oklahoma. The city of Memphis purchased it for $350 in 1946 and eventually placed it on display. For decades it sat outdoors, deteriorating from weather and vandalism. In 2005, the aircraft was trucked to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where a complete restoration was undertaken. That restoration took 13 years. In May 2018, exactly 75 years after Belle's final combat mission, the fully restored bomber went on permanent display. Klaus Becker, assuming he survived the war, would have been in his late 20s when the fighting ended. There's no record of what happened to him after Lorient. He was one of hundreds of thousands of German Flak personnel, most of whom remain anonymous in historical records. But men like him, technical specialists who saw the American bombers day after day and watched their calculations fail to produce the expected results, were among the first to understand that Germany's defensive strategy had encountered a problem it couldn't solve through better execution. The Americans hadn't built better guns. They hadn't developed invulnerable aircraft. They'd simply accepted that their bombers would be hit and designed them to function anyway. That wasn't a technological breakthrough in the traditional sense. It was an engineering philosophy adapted to industrial-scale warfare. And against that philosophy, flak batteries firing 16,000 shells per kill were never going to be enough. The reality of what the B-17 represented became clearer to German intelligence officers with each passing month of 1943 and into 1944. These were men trained to analyze enemy capabilities, to study wreckage, to interview prisoners, and to synthesize tactical lessons from combat reports. What they discovered, piece by piece, was that the American approach to bomber design reflected a different understanding of industrial warfare itself. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Koller, serving in the Luftwaffe operations staff, was responsible for collating reports from flak batteries and fighter units across Western Europe. His files from 1943 paint a picture of growing concern. Early reports had been optimistic. American bombers were being hit, formations were taking casualties, and daylight precision bombing appeared vulnerable to German defenses. But as months passed, the reports began to show a troubling pattern. The Americans were losing bombers, yes, but not enough to stop the campaign. And more significantly, they were losing fewer bombers over time, even as German defenses intensified. The technical analysis files from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility, contained detailed examinations of crashed B-17 seconds. German engineers measured the aluminum skin thickness, 0.04 inches in most sections, barely thicker than a beer can. They documented the lack of heavy armor plating in most areas. They noted the relatively exposed fuel tanks and engine mounts. By every metric of protective design that German engineers understood, the B-17 should have been easy to destroy. But the crash analysis reports told a different story. Of the B-17 seconds that went down over German-controlled territory, very few showed single points of catastrophic failure. Instead, the wreckage showed accumulated damage, multiple engine hits, fuel system failures, control surface destruction, fire. The aircraft that crashed had typically sustained damage to multiple redundant systems until finally, with enough systems destroyed, they could no longer remain airborne. This was the key insight that German analysts struggled to fully appreciate. The B-17 wasn't designed to avoid being hit. It was designed so that being hit multiple times wouldn't necessarily bring it down. Consider a specific example that made its way into Luftwaffe intelligence files. On November 6, 1944, a B-17G of the 91st Bomb Group took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell while flying over Rackheath with its bomb bay doors open and its radar dome extended. The shell struck the fuselage just forward of the ball turret, creating a massive hole that tore through the aircraft's belly. The explosion killed the ball turret gunner instantly and severely wounded the right waist gunner. The blast destroyed hydraulic lines, electrical systems, and part of the structural framework. The bomber stayed in the air. The pilot maintained control. The formation continued to target. After releasing bombs, the damaged aircraft turned for home, flying for nearly 2 hours back to England. It landed successfully at its base. Photographs taken after landing show a hole in the fuselage large enough for a man to stand in. The ball turret was completely destroyed, hanging by shredded metal, yet the aircraft had flown. German intelligence officers examining such reports had to ask, how? The answer lay in design details that seemed wasteful from a German efficiency perspective, but proved invaluable in combat. The B-17's control system, for instance, used thick steel cables running from the cockpit controls back to the tail surfaces. These cables were routed along both sides of the fuselage, providing redundancy. If flak or gunfire severed the cables on one side, the cables on the other side could still function. The cables themselves were over-engineered, thicker and stronger than strictly necessary, because Boeing's designers had anticipated they would be damaged in combat and needed margin for degraded functionality. The oxygen system followed similar principles. Each crew member carried a portable oxygen bottle that could sustain them if the main oxygen lines were cut. The system was distributed throughout the aircraft rather than centralized, so that damage to one section wouldn't asphyxiate the entire crew at 25,000 feet. Even the crew positions reflected survivability thinking. The B-17 carried 10 men, which German analysts noted was significantly more than the 7-man crew of a British Lancaster bomber. The Americans were accepting a weight penalty to ensure that critical functions could continue even with crew casualties. The pilot and co-pilot could back each other up. The navigator and bombardier both occupied the nose section, but if that section was destroyed, the flight engineer in the top turret could assist with navigation using backup instruments. The radio operator could serve as a gunner. The waist gunners could help the ball turret gunner if he was wounded and needed to be pulled from his position. This redundancy of human capability was as important as the redundancy of mechanical systems. A B-17 with 3 wounded crew members could still fly the mission. The aircraft could function with degraded capacity rather than failing entirely. German bomber design philosophy had evolved differently. The Heinkel He 111 and Junkers Ju 88 were excellent aircraft, fast and efficient. But they carried smaller crews, had less defensive armament, and were optimized for performance rather than damage absorption. This made sense for the Luftwaffe's operational doctrine in the late 1930s and early war years, when German bombers operated with fighter escort and faced limited anti-aircraft opposition. But it meant German bombers were more vulnerable when hit and had less capacity to continue functioning with partial damage. The Americans, by contrast, had designed the B-17 specifically for the mission profile it was actually flying in 1943, long-range penetration of heavily defended airspace, often without fighter escort, against targets protected by massed flak batteries and experienced fighter pilots. The aircraft's survival characteristics weren't a happy accident. They were the result of systematic design choices made years before the war began. Boeing's engineers had understood something fundamental about statistics. In any large bombing campaign, aircraft will be hit. That's mathematically inevitable. The question isn't how to prevent all hits, that's impossible. The question is, what percentage of hits result in aircraft loss? If you can drive that percentage down through design, you multiply the effectiveness of your bomber force. German flak doctrine had been built around the opposite assumption, that a certain percentage of shells fired would result in hits, and that hits would result in kills at a predictable rate. When the hit-to-kill ratio turned out to be much lower than expected, the doctrine faltered. The battle damage statistics tell the story clearly. During 1943, the 8th Air Force flying from England regularly had 50% or more of its returning aircraft showing battle damage. These were aircraft that had been hit, sometimes repeatedly, but had made it home. Photographs from debriefings show B-17 seconds with propellers shot away, entire sections of wing or tail missing, fuselage riddled with hundreds of holes. These aircraft were repaired and flew again. One particularly well-documented case involved a B-17F, named All-American, that suffered a mid-air collision with a Messerschmitt Bf-109 over Tunisia in February 1943. The German fighter struck the bomber's fuselage just behind the wing, cutting through the structure so severely that the tail section was held on only by control cables and a few strips of metal. The tail hung at an angle, partially severed. The bomber flew approximately 90 miles back to base and landed successfully. The crew survived. The aircraft was written off as unsalvageable, but the fact that it had flown at all demonstrated the distributed load-bearing capacity of the design. German technical intelligence officers studying photographs of All-American had to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their understanding of structural failure was being contradicted by American engineering. An aircraft shouldn't be able to fly with its tail nearly severed, but this one had. The psychological impact of this realization on German defenders shouldn't be underestimated. Flak crews like Klaus Becker's were being told that their weapons were effective, that they were inflicting damage, that they were defending Germany successfully, and they were inflicting damage. The black bursts from 88mm shells were tearing into bomber formations. Crew members were being wounded and killed. Engines were being destroyed. But the bombers kept coming. This created a form of cognitive dissonance among German defenders. They could see they were hitting the enemy. They could count the hits. But the tactical outcome, the percentage of bombers destroyed, remained frustratingly low. Something about the equation wasn't working the way it should. The explanation, which German intelligence eventually documented, was that American bombers had a damage threshold far higher than German planners had anticipated. A single flak hit that would cripple a Ju-88 might only force a B-17 to feather one engine and continue on three. Damage that would bring down a He-111 might leave a B-17 controllable enough to reach friendly territory. The threshold for catastrophic failure was simply higher. This had cascading effects on German defensive strategy. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was dedicating enormous resources to flak defenses. According to post-war analysis, Germany deployed more than 1 million personnel in flak units at the war's peak. Production of 88mm shells consumed significant portions of Germany's ammunition manufacturing capacity. Major industrial targets were ringed with hundreds of guns, and still the bombers came. The strategic implications became clear during the oil campaign of 1944. The Allies had identified German synthetic fuel production facilities as critical targets. These plants were heavily defended with massed flak batteries. Some targets had more than 300 heavy guns positioned around them. The Merseburg-Lonar synthetic oil complex, for instance, was considered one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. On November 2, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent 483 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds against Merseburg. German flak was devastating. 56 bombers were destroyed or crippled by flak that day, the single highest flak toll of the war for a single mission. The Germans celebrated it as a defensive victory, but the context matters. The Americans had sent nearly 500 bombers. They lost 56, that's roughly 12%, a painful loss rate, certainly, and higher than the typical 1 to 2% loss rates by that stage of the war, but not high enough to stop the campaign. The remaining 427 bombers hit the target. Significant damage was inflicted on the facility, and the Americans came back again and again. By the end of the oil campaign, German synthetic fuel production had dropped by 90%. 56 bombers lost in a single mission was a tragedy for the crews involved. But from a strategic perspective, it was a loss rate the Americans could sustain. They had the industrial capacity to replace those aircraft. They had the training infrastructure to replace those crews. And they had bomber designs that ensured the other 427 aircraft survived to fight another day. This was the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, and it was arithmetic that favored the side with greater production capacity and more survivable aircraft. Germany couldn't shoot down bombers fast enough to offset American production. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 400 heavy bombers per month. Even at the peak effectiveness of German defenses, loss rates weren't high enough to match that production rate. The Memphis Belle, flying its missions in late 1942 and early 1943, had been part of the period when American loss rates were highest, when 80% of bomber groups were being shot down over 3 months. But even then, even during the worst period of casualties, the design philosophy behind the B-17 was working. Bombers that should have been destroyed were making it home. Crews that should have been lost were surviving. The threshold between damaged and destroyed was higher than German defenses could reliably exceed. By the time the Belle completed its 25th mission, the strategic balance was already shifting. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters were beginning to escort bombers deeper into Europe. Combat tactics were improving. Formation discipline was getting tighter. The introduction of chaff, what the British called window strips of aluminum foil, dropped to confuse German radar, reduced flak accuracy by perhaps 75%. Electronic countermeasures were making German fire control systems less effective. But underneath all these tactical improvements, the fundamental advantage remained. American bombers were built to survive. That design philosophy, which seemed wasteful in peacetime when measured by efficiency metrics, proved invaluable in combat when measured by mission completion rates and crew survival. Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, flew 26 more combat missions after returning from his war bond tour, this time in B-29 superfortresses over Japan. He understood better than most what had kept him alive during those 25 missions over Europe. In later interviews, he consistently credited the aircraft itself. Not luck, though luck certainly played a role. Not just crew skill, though his crew was excellent, but the machine, the redundant systems, the distributed structure, the engineering choices that let a bomber with 3 engines shot out and its tail on fire make it home. Years after the war, Morgan would stand beside the restored Memphis Belle in the National Museum of the United States Air Force and tell visitors about missions where the aircraft had been hit repeatedly and continued flying. He would point to sections of the fuselage where metal had been torn away and patched. He would describe the moment when he looked back at the tail, saw that it was mostly destroyed, and realized he would have to fly the aircraft home with barely functioning controls. And he would explain that this wasn't a unique story. This was what B-17 seconds did. This was what they were built to do. For the young German flak gunners who watched American bomber formations pass overhead, month after month, year after year, the psychological weight of that reality must have been crushing. They were doing their jobs correctly. They were hitting the enemy. The mathematics said they should be winning, but they weren't winning. The bombers kept coming. The factories kept burning. The strategic bombing campaign continued to grind forward, mission after mission, loss after loss on both sides, until finally Germany's industrial capacity collapsed and the war ended. The Memphis Belle never flew combat again after May 1943. It didn't need to. It had already proved what American engineering could achieve when design priorities were aligned with operational reality. It had demonstrated that survivability wasn't about armor or invulnerability. It was about redundancy, distributed systems, and accepting that damage was inevitable while ensuring that damage wasn't fatal. That lesson, learned in the skies over Europe between 1942 and 1945, would influence military aviation design for generations. Modern combat aircraft still incorporate redundant systems, distributed structures, and damage-tolerance engineering. The principle that the Memphis Belle embodied, build it to survive, not just to perform, remains fundamental to military aircraft design today. Klaus Becker, if he survived the war, would have been among the hundreds of thousands of German military personnel who returned to a destroyed country and tried to rebuild civilian lives. Most flak gunners left no individual historical record. Their experiences survive only in aggregate in casualty statistics, ammunition expenditure reports, and post-war analyses of defensive effectiveness. But they were witnesses to a fundamental shift in how aerial warfare was conducted. They watched the mathematics fail. They watched their training and doctrine produce results that didn't match predictions. They watched American bombers absorb damage that should have been fatal and continue flying. And eventually, they watched Germany lose the air war, not because German weapons were ineffective, but because the Americans had solved the problem those weapons were designed to create. The final irony of the Memphis Belle's story is that it became famous for being the first to complete 25 missions, when in fact it was merely the first to return to the United States after completing 25 missions. The B-17 Hells Angels of the 303rd Bomb Group completed 25 missions a week before the Belle did. Hells Angels eventually flew 48 missions before being retired. Dozens of other B-17 seconds completed 30, 40 or more missions. Many survived the entire war. The Memphis Belle was special because it was chosen for publicity, but what it represented, an aircraft designed to survive combat through redundancy and damage tolerance, was common to every B-17 that flew. That was the point. The design philosophy wasn't about creating one exceptional aircraft. It was about creating thousands of aircraft that could all survive at higher rates than the enemy expected. When the Belle was trucked to Dayton, Ohio for restoration in 2005, workers found layers of damage and repair work throughout the airframe, patches upon patches, replaced components, sections of skin that had been torn away and fabricated anew. The aircraft was, in a literal sense, a ship of Theseus. So many parts had been replaced during its combat tour that it was unclear how much of the original airframe remained. But that too was part of the design philosophy: standardized parts, field repairable systems, damage that could be patched, and the aircraft returned to service. The 13-year restoration project was exhaustive. Workers sourced original components from salvage yards, private collections, and other museums. They replicated parts that no longer existed using original blueprints. They painted the aircraft in its wartime markings, complete with nose art and mission markers. When the restoration was complete, the Memphis Belle looked exactly as it had in May 1943, down to the patches covering battle damage. But visitors seeing the aircraft today in its museum display can't see what made it truly revolutionary. The redundant fuel system is hidden inside the wings. The distributed load-bearing structure isn't visible from outside. The backup control cables, the self-sealing fuel cells, the multiple independent electrical systems, all the engineering details that let the aircraft survive. 200 or more flak hits and keep flying are hidden within the aluminum skin. What visitors see is a bomber that looks, to civilian eyes, almost fragile. Thin metal skin, exposed framework visible through plexiglass nose. Gun positions that seem to offer little protection to the gunners. It doesn't look like a fortress. It doesn't look invulnerable. But that was never the point. The Memphis Belle was never meant to be invulnerable. It was meant to be survivable. And in the brutal mathematics of strategic bombing over Europe, survivability proved to be enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.